Welcome to the Connor's Corner segment of Ask the Lawyer. Many of you know, listening to our show, that we're always interested in history. It came to my attention a book, about Detective Joseph Petrosino and the Black Hand. And we're very fortunate to have the author of the book on, Stephen Talty. How you doing? Welcome to Connor's Corner.
I'm good. Good to be here.
First, who was Detective Petrosino?
Joseph Petrosino was an immigrant, came over when he was a teenager to America, and like many Italian immigrants at the time, took a variety of jobs to sort of make it in his new homeland. But eventually he became a New York City detective, and he was the first Italian-American sergeant detective in the country. And, just a fearless, non-corruptible, straight shooter, very intelligent, later in his career, he would have a wardrobe that was compared to the Metropolitan Opera, because he would go in disguise. He could be a government worker, a Hasidic Jew, a ditch digger, and he used all these disguises to basically attack what became his lifelong nemesis, which was kind of the mafia before the mafia, and they were called the Black Hand.
When I saw your book, I hadn't heard the term the Black Hand in I don't know how many years. What was the Black Hand?
Well, the Black Hand really flourished in America more than Italy, and it started out as an extortion racket, where you might get a letter in the mail if you were an Italian immigrant who'd made some money, if you were a grocer or a banker or something like that. And the letter might say something like, "I'm from your hometown. Congratulations on your success. I'm in need of some money." And if you refused, the notes would keep coming, and they'd get more and more threatening. "We're going to blow up your tenement building. We're going to kidnap your children. We're going to cut your head off." And it became a conspiracy where people would plant bombs in your stairwell, or they would attack your children, actually kidnap them. Some of them never came back. And so they extorted money from their fellow Italian immigrants. And that's how it started. But then it spread not only throughout the country, but non-Italians started getting these letters, started getting, extortion demands. And it became kind of all wrapped up with this fear of the Italian immigrant. It's this fear that Italians were not sort of going to be melted in the melting pot, that they were addicted to conspiracy and to violence and to crime. So it became sort of this moral panic where Italians were, a real threat to the American way. And the Black Hand was kind of the point of the sword of that.
Well, let me ask you something. Let's go back a little bit in history. How did Joseph Petrosino got his appointment as a detective?
Actually, it was Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a new police commissioner, and he saw the changing demographics of the city. He saw a lot of Italians coming in, and he saw a rise in Italian crime because many of the guys on the beat were either German or Irish. The Irish especially dominated the NYPD. They couldn't speak the language, and they also had contempt for these new Italian immigrants. If you remember that line from The Godfather, they're animals, so they have no souls. That was really how New Yorkers and Americans and the Irish American cops looked at these Italian immigrants. So the crime was growing. They had no one on the force to sort of combat it. Joseph Petrosino was not only brilliant, but he spoke all the dialects from Italy. And he became sort of Roosevelt's handpicked guy in his department to sort of lead the charge on Italian crime.
How did he attack the problem? What did he do?
He attacked it in many ways. He actually had many Black Hand suspects go into their local precincts and give a sample of their handwriting in the way today that you might give a sample of your DNA. And if letters started coming in and they could match the handwriting to the sample they had, you'd be arrested. That was an innovation that Petrosino thought up. He would also go to the drops where people left money for these Black Hand members, pretending to be the victim, and then he'd arrest them. He did that with the famous Italian opera singer Caruso, who'd been extorted several times by the Black Hand. So finally, Petrosino, who adored Caruso, actually went to the drop, jumped on the two guys who had come to take the money, and arrested them. But Petrosino also, after much lobbying, formed something called the Italian Squad, which was 6 other guys, all speaking Italian, who would go into the neighborhoods where police were often feared, and they would sort of get tips, and they would talk to people who knew who the Black Hand members were. And let me just give you one example of how sort of innovative the Black Hand was. They would actually get tellers at banks to inform on their customers. So if you brought in, a large sum of money to deposit in the bank, and you told the bank, the teller that you just received an inheritance or the money for your wedding had just come from Italy, that person would go to the head of the Black Hand, the gang in that area, and tell them so-and-so just came into some money, and you get a letter, a week later. So it was really something that had infiltrated the entire Italian-American community. And Americans really from coast to coast looked on it as a threat of what might become of our democracy if we didn't stop it.
All right, so Petrosino's in charge. Did he have cooperation from the police department? They were all on the same side, right?
You would think so, but, a lot of the Irish-American cops resented Petrosino. They felt the NYPD was theirs. They often bought little police batons for their sons who were 6 or 7 years old, saying, you're going to become a cop too. So they felt that Petrosino and the Italians were almost stealing their birthright. These jobs were going to go to the Italians. So they didn't get very much support at all, the Italian squad. They couldn't get photos for photo lineups, things like that. And they were kind of frozen out of the power structure. So Petrosino was not only battling these Italian gangsters and these killers, he was also battling his own department for respect and for funds to continue his work.
Detective Petrosino, what happened to him?
Well, he really gave his life to fighting the Black Hand. But then in 1909, they wanted to mount sort of a final offensive and get these gangsters out of America. And they chose Petrosino to actually go back to Italy to stop the flow of gangsters coming over on the ocean liners. And it was a hugely dangerous mission because Petrosino was known very well in New York. His picture was all over the newspapers. And now he was sort of going into the heart of Italian crime. But he felt that it was going to be sort of the capstone to his entire career, and he had to do it. The Black Hand was kind of dirtying the name of Italians in America. So he went over there with a disguise, but with no backup. And he started collecting the names of these Italian killers and other criminals who had gone to America under false pretenses, either because they had fake names or they had a prison record or something. And so if he could track them down, get their real names, get their prison records, he could have them deported from America. But the Black Hand found out that he was in Italy, and it was basically a transatlantic conspiracy to kill him. And in Sicily, in Palermo, in the town square, he went to a meeting that he never came back from. He was shot, died right there in Palermo, and his body was shipped back.
I know today there's a Detective Petrosino Association. Can you tell me something about it? And he still has relatives alive in the New York City area.
Yeah, he did. When I started writing the book, I kind of looked to see if he had any descendants, and there were actually quite a few Petrosinos who followed in his tradition and joined the NYPD. There was a retired district attorney in Brooklyn. There was I believe he was a captain at the time in the Queens Department. So not only his family had sort of taken inspiration, but a lot of Italian Americans had sort of appreciated the work he did because he changed the image of the Italian American in New York and in America. He was sort of the Jackie Robinson figure in that regard. So there is a Petrosino Association. They meet every year. They choose a man of the year. They do a lot of good work in keeping his name alive. I've gone to some of their banquets. And Petrosino is still the only NYPD officer who was assassinated on foreign soil. He represents kind of, going beyond the call of duty. He did this not only for the NYPD, he gave his life really to improve the image of the Italians in America and to show Americans that they weren't only gangsters, they weren't only criminals, they were hardworking Americans who would give their life for the country. And I think that's really why he's remembered. Was
his life story ever turned into a film?
There was a film in the 1950s where Ernest Borgnine, if you remember him, actually portrayed a version of Petrosino. It was not his real life. It's called Pay or Die. And it's kind of about the Black Hand, but it's heavily fictionalized. That's kind of my problem with that film. My book has been optioned by Leonardo DiCaprio's company and Paramount Pictures. So we're hoping that the kind of the true story of who Petrosino was and what he represented can sort of finally make it to the screen intact and be authentic. That's what I'm hoping for.
Let me ask you, it wouldn't be your first book that turned into a film, would it?
No, I've had two others. I wrote the book with Rich Phillips, which became Captain Phillips with Tom Hanks, about the hostage taking and the Somali pirates and the Navy SEALs who finally freed Captain Phillips. And there's another book, another memoir that I wrote with the only survivor of the fires that swept Arizona a few years back, one of these wildfires that are increasingly common in the West. And they hit a place called Granite Mountain. And that's where the guy who wrote it with, Brendan, was the lookout for 20 firefighters. 19 of them died. He was the only survivor, and he dealt with a lot of survivor's guilt. And that became a movie called Only the Brave, which came out, I think, 2 years ago.
What are you working on now?
I actually have a book coming out in April of next year. So it's about the hunt for an escaped Nazi war criminal. The story takes place in two eras, basically during the war in Latvia, which was a country that's kind of between Germany and Russia. And the Latvian Jews were trapped by the Nazi occupation. And one of the sort of local Latvians, actually, he was an aviation hero. He'd actually become something called the Latvian Lindbergh. And he'd been a friend to Jews before the war, but during it, he turned on them and became known as the Butcher of Latvia and helped kill about 30,000 of Latvian Jews. So in 1965, 20 years later, the German government was thinking of inaugurating an amnesty for all unindicted Nazi war criminals. So if anyone who was in hiding, who had done these terrible things, came under the statute of limitations, they would be free. They could never be prosecuted. And Israel wanted to stop this, so they decided to have their spy agency, Mossad, go after this one war criminal, the Butcher of Latvia, get him to another country and assassinate him as an example of all these sort of Nazi monsters who are still out there. So that's the story of the book, how this happened, how it kind of changed history, and also changed our perception of the Holocaust, really.
Let's get back to Detective Petrosino. You're not Italian, or are you?
I'm not. I'm 100% Irish.
Okay, so why did you decide to write a book about Detective Petrosino?
It's a good question. When I look back at my books, I guess the common refrain is that it's often one individual or a small group of individuals who go up against these larger forces and change history. So I was reading a history of the NYPD, and I just came across one or two sentences about Petrosino. And I thought there must be a couple of really good books on this guy. The story's fascinating. And there really wasn't. There was, kind of these fictionalized accounts and this movie with Ernest Borgnine that was not very good. So I just decided to kind of go into the original sources, into the archives, and find the real story. So that's really what drew me toward it. This guy that, in giving his life, achieved something that seemed kind of impossible at the time.
All right. Well, listen, thank you very much for, keeping history alive. Look forward to the book on the Butcher of Latvia, whatever. Again, the name of the book we've been talking about today, The Black Hand, the epic war between a brilliant detective and the deadliest secret society in American history. The author, Stephen Talty. Thank you for being on Connor's Corner.
Thank you.